Sacred Word Revealed comes to Atlanta, Georgia on March 27th through 29th, 2020. Purposed to reveal end times mysteries, to prepare the final generation, we must don the full armor of God. Featuring Zen Garcia, Gary Wayne, Stephen and Jana Ben-noon, Dr. Stephen Pidgeon, Justin James Garcia, Dr. Joye Pugh, Rob Skiba, Laurel Austin, buy your tickets now at sacredwordrevealed.com.
Awesome. We are live. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for our 10th episode of Ask Me Anything with Gary Wayne. This is your host, Joye Garcia, not Justin Garcia tonight. But I'm really excited to be here with you once again, Gary. I know it's been a while since it's been Joye and Gary. How have you been?
Been doing very, very well. And, it's amazing how fast that month goes around. Just seems like it was last week I did a show, and it's also amazing how fast the conference is coming around. And, I've got, I got the first session that I'm going to do. I think I've basically got that down. I've started on the second one, but it's just, time just seems to fly by these days.
Yeah, it's crazy that we get to finally say that the conference is next month, which is just so wild, I feel like.
Yeah.
But do you want to give people maybe a tiny sneak peek of just the subject line of what you're going to talk about?
Yeah, it's broken down into two parts. I'm speaking on Saturday morning and then on Sunday morning. And so I thought what I would do is I would preface how I approach prophecy, and maybe if that helps people in terms of how to evaluate, how to look at prophecy for themselves, or what other people say about prophecy, because there's so many different approaches. And I just try and make it very, very simple. So I'll walk through that, and then I'll show them an example of how I do that as I walk through Matthew 24. And then I'm going to reveal some very interesting things as we do that, because to me, the whole conference is about revealing things that maybe people hadn't thought about or hadn't heard before. And then I'm going to move in on the Sunday. I'm going to dig into 3 or 4 or 5 significant, depending on how fast I can get through it, but explain it properly, reveal some things about end time prophecy that I think is going to be very beneficial to them. So, I want to deal with some, real key sort of points, and then, throw in a couple of interesting little ones as well.
Oh, that's going to be awesome. Yeah. If you haven't gotten your ticket, if you're listening, if you haven't gotten your ticket, please do check out sacredwordrevealed.com. And we will be meeting up March 27th, which is coming up so soon. It's so wild. But I know we're here to answer questions. So let's get into those. As first, I will do a really quick prayer for us, and then we'll jump into questions. So, Father, we thank you so much for bringing us here once again together to study your word, to truly just speak on our curiosities and get our questions answered. We thank you so much for Gary Wayne, who has truly dedicated his life to research and just studying out your truth. We thank you so much for his heart to share that knowledge with us. And so we ask that you would pray that you would speak through Gary tonight, and that many would be blessed by this session. We thank you so much for your love. And as always, we mostly thank you so much for salvation through you, Jesus Christ, Yahusha Christ. We thank you so much for your love. In Yahusha's name we pray, amen.
Amen.
All right, first question of the night from Mr. B. Can Gary give his viewpoint about dimensions, the prince of power of the air in Ephesians 2:2? I assume this is Satan's realm. appears the good angels must pass through this realm to get messages to us.
It's certainly a very, very good question, and it can go in a few different directions. So I think we need to understand that, and I think most people do, that this world, this physical world that we're in, and the universe that we're located in, I think has, falls under the governance of Satan. And certainly what we do know, as scripture tells us, at least temporarily it does, and until the end time for the earth. But in 2 Corinthians 4:4 talks about Satan being the god of this world. And so the Ephesians quote is still talking about that as in the air or the atmosphere, as you take that back to Greece. And so he's the prince of this world, or the archon of this world. And we need to understand that all the other angels that rebelled, and the demons, and any other pieces in that angel hierarchy are answering to Satan. And so he has control over this. Well, how much he has control over, portals into, let's say, the underworld and things like that, hard to know. But what we do know is he's the prince of this air. And prince of the earth. So I would say for angels who are coming to appear in it, they're not actually traveling through a domain to get to the earth to interact with the people of the earth. I believe that when they enter into the physical realm and into the earth, that is the domain. So getting here isn't a problem. But there may be an issue where, once they get to the point of entering this world, well, maybe there's some resistance. We don't scripturally get any verses that I've come across that says that there's anything that's preventing the angels from coming in. But who knows? There may be even just a welcoming committee that's during them. I mean, who knows? Because we know there's fallen angels that aren't in the abyss, and that there would not be a fan of angels coming from heaven to enter into their world. So they might be during, just as Jesus had, according to Psalms, having all of these different types of spirit beings and demons and fallen angels jeering at him while he was on the cross during the crucifixion. So I think we might get some of that. But what we do know is that whether it's Michael or it's Gabriel, or God with his throne in Ezekiel, they can cross into this realm. And I think with the power and the authority of God that he would send with his angels into this world. And I would also put in the angel of the Lord that is with Israel in the Exodus in the time of the conquest. So, and any of the other angels that are talked about, whether it's the ones at Sodom, I think they come with the power and the authority and the seal of God. And I don't think that they have any issues in coming in. But that doesn't mean that there isn't this gallery of hissing and booing and howling and all the different descriptions that we get of the fallen ones as they're I guess just distracting God's messengers, but certainly they come through. So I think it's a very, very good point, but it's limited. Their realm is limited, and all they seem to be trying to win in their fight against God is a realm on their own, which seems to be the physical earth. Whether or not it transcends that or not, I haven't found anything biblically that would say it would transcend anything other than the earth. So it seems to be that. That's kind of reflected in that movie Doctor Strange, where earth is the only place in all of the physical universe and multiple universes that they want to have that's separate from this evil, dark god of universes. And of course, they're portraying God as that evil God, just as they always do in all of their organizations that follow them or religions that worship them. So I think it's limited to the earth, would be my opinion, and they don't have to travel through anything. They enter into it. And however that portal or that doorway or how the spirit realm works, can't always say for sure, but they have the ability to come in both spirit form and then in physical form as they get into the physical world.
Thank you. Next question is from MGM. Are there any instances of the original 1/3 of the fallen angels mating with humans to produce offspring? And did this occur in the time period prior to the incursion of the Watchers creating the Nephilim? If this did occur, please provide details of the offspring that was produced and how they would have been different than the Nephilim.
Yeah, that's a very murky area. So I'll talk about what we do know, and I'll maybe speculate a little bit. But what we don't get is smoking gun verses other than Genesis 6, where the sons of God go to human females and create offspring. That was a violation against the laws of creation. But what we do know is there's also a history before Genesis 6, and in the time of Noah and the time of Jared, and many generations, before that, less than 10, but probably at least 6 generations before that. And then you have the Eden account, and then the speculation and the theory that there was 2 creations of day 6 and the Eden account, and then throw in the gap theory. So you start throwing in all these different possibilities, and there may be something to it. But before we get too far back on that, if we look at the day 6 people, let's start with the Eden account. And we've got 2 things going on in Eden where there's a possibility that something may have happened. Maybe it's a little bit different than the Genesis 6 account where they actually copulated with human females. But 2 things happened in Eden that always raise some speculation, one more than the other. But I'll start with the first one, and that's with the Nakash. And the Nakash is the serpent. And this is the serpent that I believe that Satan actually enters into, as he does with Judah, to help Judas betray Jesus in the New Testament. I think he does the same with the Nakash, because it's not Satan who has his arms taken off, or his legs taken off, or his speech taken away, or his intelligence taken away, but it's this upright, walking, talking, intelligent, most craftiest of individuals that is serpent-like after the Watchers form, with my understanding of the Watchers being a serpentine form, at least from the seraphim order of angels, although there are the cherubim and the Ophanium, that would be the other 2 that are around the throne. But from the Watchers, you get the fiery serpent understanding or definition from seraph or seraphim, which is the male plural, and that comes in Isaiah 6, where it's quite clearly, and they work within the throne area, within the burning stones before the altar, and they have a face of a viper, and so the Nephilim offspring would have had an image just like that. At least from the seraphim serpent angels, they would have looked like their parents, or at least their fathers. And so with the Nakash, we don't get an account in Genesis of how this intelligent, walking, talking being came about. It just sort of shows up. And then after Eden, he becomes what is known as the serpent. That we have come accustomed today, that crawls on the ground and is the lowest form and a vile form of being that everybody looks down upon. But the Nakash was the craftiest of the beings before, or at the time, even as Adam being created. So does that now mean that they were around when the day 6 people were created? My position is that I can't reconcile Genesis 1 with Genesis 2. So to me, there's 2 different creation accounts. And again, so if somebody wants some detail on that, get a hold of me through my website, genesis6conspiracy.com, or on Facebook or on Twitter, and ask me for that document. I'll send it out to you. So it's interesting that if I can't reconcile that because the details are all different, and that Adam seems to have a completely different commission than the people in day 6. And yet we also have this other being that's a serpent being after the image of seraphim angels. How does that come about? Because we don't get a specific creation for this intelligent, sentient being that conspires with Satan to bring down the Adam and Eve beings that were created as a solution to the angelic rebellion, and somehow greater than likely the people of day 6. So there seems to be animosity between this seraph type of, I guess, serpent type of mammal that is around in the time of Eden. So did the angels procreate with some other animals to do that? Did they do some DNA manipulation to create a being after their kind? Because this Nakash serpent imagery is also, equivalent to the crocodile in many of the pantheons, like the Egyptian pantheon, and Sobek, the crocodile god, and as being the same type of being. Only in this case, it's a quadruped. But has that same sort of root in antiquity that's also connected to the royal bloodlines, not only through the seraphim angels, but through the serpentine imagery that they connect in polytheism back to this fallen Nakash, that it was a being that was greater than Adam before being created. And in that belief, because they certainly have a belief in the day 6 people as being a different account in terms of how the Bible would reconcile it, they would look at the day 6 people as being like the blackheads of Sumeria and all the other different types of races that are around the world. And so, and the ones that would have been created in multiples that the gods gave knowledge to and civilized. And so was this being then superior in that period between day 6 and the Eden account as a representative, as a kingly type of figure of the day 6 people, or a superior race to them, as they would have established a being that was after their image over the humans created in day 6. And so they may have been being assisted by the seraphim angels as well in ruling over or persecuting humanoids. And so they may have been at odds, but we don't know that. The other account that comes out of Eden, and I'm agnostic on this, but I do recognize that it's a possibility, is that Cain is acquired and is not the offspring of Adam and Eve, even though it says that in the Bible. There's a lot of people that believe in serpent seed coming from Cain. And of course, as a serpent seed, that's the seraphim aspect of Satan, even though he's an archangel and he's also cherubim, as he's just talked about in Ezekiel, in the book of Ezekiel. So this serpentine line would have come down through Cain if it had actually existed, and then intermarried with likely the people of day 6 when he moves into Nod. And looking forward to some of the questions. I won't spend too much time on that right now because we're going to get into that aspect on another question down the road. So again, we get this serpentine image that is coming up in terms of what they looked like. So what we don't get, though, is from the Bible is was there this serpentine image that could have been in the time before creation, or the renewal of the earth, or the gap theory, that somehow the earth had become destroyed, void, and formless, Tuhu and Boohoo. And again, I have a great handout on that for people if they want to document on that. I'll lay that out for you. Just get a hold of me. But that seems to be where the rebellion of the angels for me would fit better, is in that time frame. And from that rebellion, the earth became void. So what kind of beings were there? Could have been the dinosaurs, right? Because of what science is telling us. Although I know we can't rely on NASA, and we can't rely on science because they're all puppets of the polytheist organizations, and everything that they're doing is designed to lead us from God as opposed to show us the truth. There might be some truth to the age of the dinosaurs. I'm not dogmatic on it, but they would fit back in there because, again, we're finding that these dinosaurs a lot of them had feathers on them and are serpentine looking, just as the seraphim would be feathered serpent god like Quetzalcoatl or the Nagas or many of the other accounts around the world. So you can see how those types of beings may have been their preferred image in a time before Genesis 1:2, and when the earth became void and formless would be how that gap theory goes. So there's a possibility there as well. Now, we also get from the Gnostics two different kinds of giants being created. So in the Holy Book of the Invisible Spirit, for example, it talks about the first seed of Amaka Seth, which is a being that's created by the angels within a cloud. So again, we don't know whether or not that is some sort of allegory for DNA manipulation, or he's actually an offspring of the gods and a human female, or some other version thereof. And he is first going to show up, according to this Holy Book of the Invisible Spirit, in chapter 71, where I'm referring to, at Gomorrah, and then after the flood, because he's saved and taken off planet again, seemingly in a cloud, and his next incarnation is at Sodom after the flood, which kind of reflects like a second incarnation after the flood. So we get that kind of being also being created, and that Amaka Seth, predates Genesis 6 in their accounts. So from a polytheist view, we get that kind of creation as well. But I would also suggest that out of polytheism, and again, I've got some great handouts on this and documents on these types of beings that I'm going to talk about. We don't know when they're created. I would suspect after Genesis 6, because we don't get specific dates for these kinds. And we only get the Nephilim type of creature being clearly identified in Genesis 6, which is why I kind of lean in that direction. And that the sons of God, or the angels, went to human females at that time, and then again afterwards. And we don't know how many times afterwards. So now if you can imagine the lion men of Moab, which would be, I think, part of the second incarnation, or second incursion after the flood as well as before the flood. You could have had lion type of Nephilim before the flood, after lion like gods. So one of those gods would be, in Gnosticism, would be Ariel, which is a Hebrew word for lion. And just as you get lion, that goes back to Ariel. When you take the word lion back to Hebrew, and it's talking about the lion men of Gad, or the lion like men of Moab. And so there's many gods in polytheism in their pantheon that are lion-faced. You also have these Tengu type of Nephilim that are bird-faced, whether it's a falcon or it's a raven or whatever look that you want, but we'll just say generically bird-faced. And when you look at the Anunnaki gods that are shown in some of the ancient antediluvian reliefs, they have this bird type of look. And I think those were kind of the offspring of these Tengu would have been the offspring of that kind of angel, or falcon as in Horus. So there's many different kinds of these around the world, or the Zabelba name for Tengu that's in the Kishimaya, that are demigod offspring and lived in the underworld as well. And they all had a very, very similar look, or the Thunderbird people. And they created them to create an order of priests and a warrior ruling class as well, just as the serpentine looking ones were created in a warrior and a priest class, which is where the polytheism sort of nobility aspect comes in the polytheist history. And you would also have possibly a Nephilim type of being that would have been created from, let's say, Anubis, which was a jackal or a dog type of being. In fact, there was, a dog city in Egypt at some point in time, and there's many, Christian mythoses about dog men and dog warriors, and connecting back to the same type of individuals, in the Christian history, mostly in the Eastern Orthodox, but alongside of Saint Christopher, but in the Catholic version, you don't get much of a dog sort of connection there. But again, I've got a great document, 3-part series on that handles the gods that were dog-like, the warrior aspect, the historical accounts, and it's rather enlightening if you want a whole bunch of information on that. So when we look at what could these beings have looked like, if you read into the Pistis Sophia, we have all kinds of different looking angels that are in the underworld abyss, and they're like dogs and lions and serpents, and some of them are the Hydra versions, and they're all in these various prisons there for the crimes that they did before the flood. And these are archonic rulers. And so I think it's very much as what you see depicted in the Ogdoad gods, where you have those different kinds of looking of angels that once ruled but are now in the abyss. And the Ogdoad, that's Agdoad. Google that picture, you'll get some really weird looking gods that were the parent gods of the Egyptian pantheon that would have produced as the second tier gods Osiris, which was a serpent god, and Isis, and that whole pantheon that ruled underneath the parent gods. So anyways, I've probably covered a little more ground than I intended to on this, but it's a big area when you talk about what could have happened, and you start connecting it with some of the tidbits of information that we have in the Bible that then intersects with some of the polytheist accounts.
Thank you. Next question is from Iron Fist. Oh, actually, before I go into the next question, you mentioned a couple times that people can get a hold of you to get certain documents. Can you please remind people where they can get a hold of you, as well as where they can get your book?
Yes, so you can get a hold of my book, a signed copy, through my website, genesis6conspiracy.com. That's the number 6conspiracy.com. I've got a generous excerpt of all 98 chapters on that website, so you can get a good feel for the book. You can get a signed copy there, or you can click over to Amazon to get the Kindle version, or get the book through amazon.ca, amazon.com, or through barnesandnoble.com. So I have links there if you want to go that route as well. And on my website, I have an email. So if you email me a question or a topic area like second incursion, or something about Pistis Sophia, or the Lion Men, or whatever, if you give me that topic area, if I've got a document on that, I'll send it to you. And the same way through Facebook under Messenger, Gary Wayne, or on my timeline, post on there. It's open to everybody. And or you can get a hold of me through Twitter at GaryWayne63, at GaryWayne63.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So next question is from Iron Fist. What is the difference between matriarchal bloodlines and patriarchal bloodlines?
Yeah, great question. So I don't generally take this all the way back to the full sort of meaning of it, but I will tonight. Obviously, we know the difference between male and female, and these are kind of the bloodlines. But let's introduce the concept of gods and goddesses. Goddesses. I'll get that word out. The female gods. And so whether or not it's Isis, or it is Gaia, or Ninkursag, or many of these female gods of the pantheon, they took a female physical look in the physical world, just as whether it's Zeus, or it's Anu, or it's El, or it's Baal, they took a male form of whatever type of being that they wanted. So there was male and females in the polytheist pantheon, and that's because not only could they take a physical form in this world, they could take a physical form of gender in this world as well, by implication, and by what we see people of the polytheist religions worshiping. And so this mother god aspect is very, very important in polytheism. And so we get from the accounts out of the Bible that these offspring of the gods were mostly male. But I expect there was probably some females in there as well as we get into some of the other accounts. But we also have female goddesses that may have mated with male humans to create another line that goes directly back to them. So you have this patriarchal line that would go back to a male angel, and you would have a female line that goes right back to a female goddess. And a good example of that would be Tiamat. And this is where you start to bring some of these imageries together, is that Tiamat is very much a Leviathan type of figure as she comes out of the Sumerian mythology, and whether or not you're talking about Lotan or all the different names around the world, whether it's Varita out of the Hindu pantheon, and many other names that I won't get into the detail on. They all are basically Leviathan-like figures. And so Tiamat creates a whole bunch of other types of beings like Nephilim type of beings, and including the scorpion gods, the Gerdabalu or the Akrababalu, as they're called on different transliterations of these beings that look like what's in the Revelation that's going to come out, led by a bad Napoleon in the end time. And so she is the dragon queen of the origination as a parent god of prehistory. And Lilith would have been a downstream version of a lower god or a demigod sending back to Tiamat. And I lay that out in my book as we get into the end of the book if people want to get, go buy the book and find a lot more on that what I'm talking about. And so you have this line that goes back to Tiamat that has this dragon imagery, but when it takes the allegorical imagery coming down the matriarchal line, it's going to be more of a fairy or owl imagery that they'll take for the allegory. And the patriarchal version is they will take the raven and the serpent look as it comes down on the patriarchal albigens. And albigens is a word that goes back basically to one patriarch. And that's how all of these genealogies are tracked through prehistory through the bloodlines. And so when in history and in ancient history, they went to start a new dynasty in a new area, they would take the most ennobled of this matriarchal branch that they would search everywhere for, and then match that up with the designated male of the patriarchal line to start a new kingship or new dynasty. So as the world was being repopulated after the flood, or being taken over before the flood by the giants, that's how they would start a new dynasty and a whole new set of bloodlines. So in the polytheist understanding, this matriarchal branch is very, very important for how you set up a new kingdom, and then she has to have extraordinary ennobled bloodlines that would be also matched up with somebody of extraordinary patriarchal bloodlines. But it's all part of how they classify where and how they fit in this dualism that's within polytheism, in terms of the balance that they need to have in that type of religion. And it also goes right back to they believe God and Satan are equal as you extend out that dualism. And as you pull that back into sort of a micro level, you have within it, you have the good witches and the bad witches, you have good Nephilim and you have bad Nephilim, you have white magic and you have black magic. So there's yin and yang, and dualism is very, very consistent in their belief system, and therefore for them to keep that in some sort of continuity, you need to have that dualism in the bloodlines as well.
Thank you. Next question is from Man of Milford. You mentioned the enemy will counterfeit the events of Revelation. I have heard of a false/fake rapture using blue beam technology, but have not heard any mention of a false second coming after the false Armageddon using this same technology. Do you believe that all of these events will be faked?
Well, I think there'll be a counterfeit. So it will seem very, very plausible. So one should expect that, and I'll pick off each of these ones a little bit separately because there's three different concepts in there in the question. So one could easily make an argument that it would be easier for the spurious forces to just ignore the rapture and just pass that off as a fictional event that's just made up and it's part of the Jesuit conspiracy, blah, 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 blah. I don't think they're going to do that. I think it's very clear that rapture is part of the prophetic doctrine. It says it over and over and over and over and what it is. And so I think that when you understand that everything they're doing is counterfeit, so they want a counterfeit world with a counterfeit God and Satan. They want to live away from God, and they want to have a counterfeit millennium that they're offering in the new age. Everything, they have a counterfeit religion. So if they're going to deceive people in the end time, then they have to fulfill all of these things in a counterfeit way with false signs, false miracles, everything that the Bible lays out prophetically. They are going to have their own version that happens on a shorter time frame as opposed to the longer time frame. And what I mean by that is they have the time just before the last 7 years where this starts to happen, then the first 3.5 years, and then at that point in time is when they're going to introduce the new age. So these events that we're going to talk about in terms of the rapture now and the second coming and false Armageddon needs to play into that timetable if they're going to deceive the people, because they're going to bring about their false Messiah, their counterfeit Messiah, before Jesus comes to deceive people. And of course, we get that pretty clearly outlined in prophecy, where Antichrist will take power at the midpoint of the last 7 years, and Jesus comes at Armageddon towards the end of the last 7 years and the last part of the 3.5 years of the second half. And that time frame is a little bit shortened, otherwise everything would be destroyed. So that's why I say near the end of the last 7 years. So that means that if Antichrist is going to fake being Jesus, then he needs to come and do a rapture and then come back for Armageddon. And so at some point in time, they're going to have to fake that, whether it's by blue beam or however they do it, whether or not they just murder people and make them disappear. They're going to have people disappear. Whether or not these are the people who come back or not at the time of Armageddon, I think is probably going to be a deception. I think that the people that will be helping the people of the earth to fight are going to be demons and fallen angels and whatever other creatures that they've created that have survived. That's part of the alien mythos. However you want to create that alliance, they're going to come back as these raptured people with Antichrist to bring in this age of peace. So it's going to have a very, very similar sort of imagery to what happens at Armageddon. Now, in terms of a false second coming, what they're going to present is doctrine they're already teaching. So that if you look at Lord Maitreya, he's considered the Antichrist figure out of the Hindu belief system, and that has transposed itself over into Western polytheist beliefs with the term Lord Maitreya. And that is basically the new Buddha. And what Lord Maitreya is and what the new Buddha is, as what Buddha was an incarnation of the god Vishnu. And so I think we're going to get an incarnation. And this is that Christ consciousness doctrine of the New Age. So that in an incarnation, this is that avatar effect, similar to what Satan did when he goes into Judah. And in how they define that is typically they come into a body at a young age, but they can come in at any age and provide extraordinary knowledge, wisdom, and power to that individual in a symbiotic relationship, which is different than a demon possession. So this will be a fallen angel that would do it, not a demon. Symbiotic relationship that provides a lot of powers. And I expect this is going to happen in the end time with Antichrist. And we do know that he receives a mortal head wound. So I think you're going to get an incarnation and a falsified resurrection that is going to ascend Jesus to, or it's ascend Antichrist to power as the fake Jesus, coupling all of that at the same time with an incarnation of one of these gods. And I think that is going to be the god that leads these scorpion beings out of the abyss just before the midpoint of the last 7 years, who is Abaddon, Apollyon, and who I think is Azazel. And again, I have a great document for people if they want me to link all of that together. And that the reason why I think he is going to incarnate into Antichrist is because the son of perdition is what Antichrist is called, and Antichrist is also described in Revelation 17 as the one who comes up out of the abyss, who once was, now is not, but will be again. And we know this is a human individual because it says it's he, and he's very much described as a human demigod type figure. And I think this is how he gains his demigod status, is this incarnation. And understand that this incarnation of Azazel, Abaddon, Apollyon into Antichrist is connected through the word son of perdition. Perdition goes back to basically the word Apollyon as destroyer, just as Abaddon means destroyer, and just as Azazel was the destroyer of the antediluvian world. And Antichrist will honor a god of forces in the book of Daniel. And that's the Hebrew word Mauz, and that goes back to Az and Azaz and Ez, which goes back to Ez, goes back to the scapegoat classification and series of words, which produces Azazel and is the translation of scapegoat from the King James Version Bible on the Day of Atonement in Leviticus 16. And so this is the god that Antichrist is going to honor, the destroyer god, Apollyon, Abaddon, and the god of forces. So I think all of that sort of connects that as being that incarnation of that Christ fake consciousness doctrine that polytheists have, that's going to give Antichrist significant power and push him up over the top. But he still needs Armageddon to fulfill his credentials and a whole bunch of other things, but just dealing with what's in the question here. And so you have this war in Revelation 9 right after Abaddon, Apollyon, Azazel come out of the abyss with the scorpion beings. And it's a 200 million man army, which everybody thinks for the most part is the Armageddon army. But it's not. It's the same beings that are in, if you look at those very interesting beings and war machines that are described in Revelation 9, it's identical to what's being described in Joel 1 and 2, which isn't the Armageddon War. Armageddon War follows after that in Joel 3 and 4. And so that's the war that I think it is. And I think that's the Gog War of Ezekiel 38 and 39, because this isn't the Gog War of Revelation 20. Ezekiel 38 says that this is in the latter days. And in Ezekiel 39, you have the second Exodus being discussed, which happens in the last 3.5 years, but the awakening happens just before. And this war will happen before the midpoint of the last 7 years, because Antichrist is going to take credit for this war. And I also think that he's going to be bringing in beings in this fake rapture that will come either at the time of that battle or immediately after. But after the war, he becomes crowned in the temple. As Luke says, his armies will surround Jerusalem, and he will be crowned in the temple as the king of Jerusalem at the midpoint of the last 7 years. And then Judea flees to the desert. And then that's the same timing as you have in Revelation 12, and the same people fleeing to be protected by God when you have the war in heaven. And I think that's when that fake rapture is being brought into play as helping bringing this Armageddon thing to fruition. So I think all of that is the counterfeit that is going on. And then you'll have the bowl judgments after, and you'll have Armageddon 3.5 years, just short of 3.5 years after that.
Thank you. Next question is from Man of Milford as well. I have seen many YouTube channels telling people that the end of the world is here and will happen in, for instance, the next few months. These channels continue to deliver the same message multiple times over and over again, and are consistently wrong to the point where I can no longer listen to them. Would it be reasonable to say that some of these channels are produced by the enemy, essentially having the effect of either burning people out, scaring them, and or making them feel as if they are helpless and thus giving up?
I think some of them are. Some of them are just, they've deceived themselves, and they believe that they're talking through the Holy Spirit. And you have to be very, very careful when people are making dates on things. So unless they're a true prophet, and I don't think we're going to see any until the 144,000 and the two witnesses come, and then the prophets again that are coming with Israel and Judah as they're awakening for their role in the end time. You have to weigh everything that they say against what it says in the Bible. And if it's not congruent with what it says in the Bible, then there's something wrong here. So I think there's design misinformation, and then there's some people that are, maybe are just in it for themselves or truly being deceived by demons. I mean, they could be speaking to demons and believe that they're speaking to the Holy Spirit, but they're not testing the Spirit. So they're easily deceived. But we don't know the day of the rapture. We don't know the exact time of the end time and or Armageddon. Not even Jesus knows. Only God knows. And so anybody who's going to make those predictions, you have to be very, very wary of. We should be aware of the signs and of the times. And we can generally generalize when that should take place based on the signs that we're seeing against what's overlaid in the Bible, but we can't just use a few of the signs. You have to use all of the scripture, and until everything's in place, none of that's going to be accurate. So yeah, I think we need to be very, very careful on that. But the first sign is they're making specific dates, and they do not have that power to do so in terms of rapture or the end of the world. Now, when we get into like the two witnesses of the end time, they are going to prophesy calamities and disasters and be very, very accurate on it. But they're true prophets that will be sent from God for the end time, and that people will hate these two witnesses because of the prophecies that they're making. And when they are killed at the midpoint of the last 7 years, they're going to celebrate like it was Christmas because of the horrible things that were brought down. And all of what two witnesses are designed to do is to try and wake people up that the end is coming, but not then. Just as Jesus said, that's for the tribulation that follows after that, which is worse than what was in the first 3.5 years. That's when the bowl judgments are going to come. So absolutely, as soon as somebody is saying something like, I'm going to put a date on it, or if they're expressing things that they have been given wisdom from the Holy Spirit or somewhere else, but it's not congruent with what the Bible says, then you should get your spidey senses saying, hey, I better be very careful with this individual.
Thank you. Next question from Iron Fist. How do royal bloodlines flow through the Vatican at start to today? many different families and countries try to obtain role of pope.
Yeah, so whenever there's power, you're going to have the royal bloodlines involved somehow, some way. And of course, the Catholic Church became one of the most powerful organizations in its peak, the world has ever seen. And it is still very, very powerful today. So understand that, if you're running the world, you want to somehow be able to influence and run the Vatican, if not consistently, at least intermittently. And you do that by being part of the papal nobility. So when I talk about the royal families, there's several different groups of the Rex Deus clans or the black nobility. And in Italy, they have a specific black nobility just devoted to the Vatican. And it's part of the greater black nobility. And so you'll have families that are part of this black nobility, and their descendants claim that sort of descendancy as papal nobility or the black nobility. And some of them will have several people, like the Borgia family. I think they had 3 popes down through the lines, and heavily interwedded into the royal bloodlines as well. Like there's a Borgia in 1570 who was a member of the Montesa order in Spain that was formed to get control of the Templar wealth, and he takes over in the 1500s on that, and then he starts to sponsor Ignatius of Loyola, who becomes the first leader of the Jesuit organization. But by 1570, Borgia has, not only as being a leader of the Montesa royal family order, he is going to take over the Jesuit order as the third sort of Grand Master of that order, or leader of that order. And so you have this bloodlines of families that are always jockeying for power, and to get their families nominated into the cardinals as the lower, not the lower, but the younger siblings, to go into the church and work their way up so that they can get control over the church. Now, this black nobility out of Italy, which has some of their families in the church, they also have bloodlines that go back to Julius Caesar and Augustus. And of course, they take their bloodlines back to the gods of Italy or gods of Rome, just as all of the royal families take their pedigree back to a specific angel and a set of bloodlines and their offspring that come down through the Nephilim. So yes, there are those bloodlines that are in there today, and they're very, very powerful in choosing who's going to be, the next pope. And ideally, like I say, and there's a interesting thing. There's that show on TV. I watched a couple of it this year. I didn't see the first edition of it, called The New Pope. And they've gone to a royal family in England here to get a second-tier sibling, even though his twin died, who was the one that they would have wanted to become pope. He's elected the pope. And he's reluctant to take it, or at least he's showing that he's going to be reluctant. And they're threatening to have a Norman nobility bloodline that they're going to offer it to if he doesn't take the popeship. So again, they like to show everything in plain sight as to what they do. And that's the type of thing that goes on with the election of the pope. Now, not always do you have a pope that's elected that's of the black nobility, but it's a very, very powerful force within the Catholic Church for sure.
Thank you. Next question is from Mike. I've heard the following from 3 statements from Gnostics. First being Satan and Yahweh have equal power. Number 2, their God is impersonal, a life force. And number 3, they worship a pantheon of gods with Satan at the top. Are these 3 statements compatible? For example, do they worship Satan as part of a pantheon, knowing that he is very near the top, but that there is a life force even above Satan?
That's a very, very, very good question. So in terms of how Gnostics or polytheists would look at this, is that the supreme power in Christianity is a personal God. the supreme energy or life force is an impersonal God. So it's not thought of as in the same sort of terms that we do. So I'm just going to pull out from a Gnostic book. It's the Secret Book according to John that sort of talks about it, and then I'll get into a couple of those other layers there. So, and it's called the Immortals, and starts off where it says, the parent of the entirety is the perfect invisible virgin spirit. And this is an androgynous quintet of aeons, constituents of the parent. And so this is the whole basis, this invisible force spirit that is going to create the lower levels of the pantheon thereafter. And Sophia, which is sort of the wisdom sort of nature, or the Holy Spirit kind of nature, as you would look at that from a biblical perspective, and or Barbelos is another name that people might be familiar with, is created from this life force, shortly thereafter, that is going to then create from her offspring an angel named Aiel de Boath, or Demarriage. And this would be the angel that the Gnostics call the God of the Bible. And again, if somebody wants to get a hold of me, I'll give you a couple of examples out of the Gnostic Gospels where they actually say that. I won't do that here. And alongside of Aiel de Boath, there are 6 other angels. So this original sort of 7 number, that's kind of a constant that's out there underneath sort of the parent kind of God aspect. But Aiel de Boath is also known as Samael and Sakles as well. So the other angels that are created with Aiel de Boath are Ios, Sabaoth, Anadeos, Aleos, Aureus, and Astaphaxes, as I try and get that out of my mouth. So these are the ones that are also represented by the 7 heavens and the 7 planets in their belief system. So when you're getting pantheons that are assigned to that number of 7, that was the number of the planets and things that they could see from their domed Earth as they envisioned it at that time. So the 7 planets would take on these names of these different angels, and they all have different vernacular names as they go around the world. So if you wanted to use the Latin one, which is the easiest one to use, you've got Saturn at the top, which would be Satan. And you have Jupiter, you have the sun, you have Saturn at the top, then Jupiter, and then Sol for the sun, and Diana for the moon, and Mercury for Mercury, and Venus for Venus, and Mars for Mars. But in let's say Greece as another example, you would have Kronos, which is the equivalent to Satan here, and Zeus below that, and Apollo and Artemis and Hermes, Aphrodite and Ares. And then over in Sumeria, you would have Anu and Enki, and you'd have other ones in there like Nergal and Inanna, Shamash. And then in Canaan, you have El, Baal, which is the son of El, and Shamash, Astarte, and Moloch, and others as well, as they fill out those sort of lower level of the planets as they use for their symbology. So the point of all of this is that not only does the evil God that they call our God of the Bible come out of this universal life force, he is downgraded to angelic level and creates another 7 of his, angels that are separate from the ones that are the good ones in the classic Gnostic dualism. So when you look at the parent God, you generally get a representative of that parent God in that second tier of gods. So Kronos would be a parent God in the Greek mythology, and then Zeus would be considered the leader of that, coming out of the seven main angels in the Olympus gods below. So when you start to look at Kronos, look at that as Satan sort of being just above that. So you have the 7 plus 1 for 8. The 1 is Satan is always going to be is the 8th, coming from those parent gods. And then if you look at Anu in Sumeria, then you would have Anki and Enlil as an example as being part of that lower level, but they're created by Anu. And so El, in the same thing in the Canaanite pantheon, who produces Baal, and then other gods below that. So you have that same sort of consistency, but they're all created from this virgin spirit of the universe that creates everything, as opposed to being what we would know as this all-powerful God that actually has an entity, even though it's omnipotent, omnipresent, but greater than this life force that they're substituting, because they need something to substitute it, because Satan is not a creator God. He's known as the great architect of the universe, because he builds out of things that are already here as an architect would. And they look at Boath or as God, as being the one who messed up the earth, but still not that life force of the earth. So below that, and he is created out of that. But I would submit, though, that when you look at how Boath is described in Gnostic Gospels, he actually would, in my opinion, out of the Gnostic Gospels, be Satan just by his name, Samael and Saklas. Everything points to what he does as being the Satan of the Gnostic Gospels. But understand, the Gnostic Gospels are trying to turn everything inside out and upside down and just lead people away from the true God and just confuse people.
Thank you. All right, so it is 9:02 p.m. That's perfect timing for a quick break. We'll start with the trailer, and we'll be right back.
Sacred Word Revealed comes to Atlanta, Georgia on March 27th through 29th, 2020. Purposed to reveal end times mysteries. To prepare the final generation, we must don the full armor of God. Featuring Zen Garcia, Gary Wayne, Stephen and Jana Ben-noon, Dr. Stephen Pidgeon, Justin James Garcia, Dr. Joye Pugh, Rob Skiba, Laurel Austin, buy your tickets now at sacredwordrevealed.com.
Yes, we're very excited for the conference coming up March 27th through 29th. We want to let everyone know that we're actually doing a giveaway of 2 Sacred Word Revealed full access tickets. It's actually going to be a raffle, and you can buy a raffle ticket at sacredwordpublishing.com, and we'll also post a link in the comments and description below this video. But the raffle ticket's only $1 per ticket, and 100% of those proceeds will be going to the new Endeavor Freedom Orphanage in Lahe, Myanmar. So please do support us and also get a chance to win those free tickets. The raffle will be taking place during the live stream of AMAs with Zen Garcia on episode 35 on Friday, February 28th. And that's when the winners will be announced during the midpoint of the stream. And then we'll make sure to email those who won afterwards. So please do check out sacredwordpublishing.com, and you can, in the search bar, type in raffle tickets, or you can also just click the link that we're going to add into the live stream chat, as well as the description below this video. With that, I will move on to the next. What was that? All right. Justin wants to talk about the patrons. All right. We want to also give a big shout out and just show our gratitude to all of our patrons who truly made all of these different programs possible. We're so grateful for your support in our ministry and in our family. So thank you so much, everyone. And if you are interested in knowing how you could be a patron yourself, please go to patreon.com/Sacred Word Publishing. And with that said, we will move on to the next question. All right. Next question is from Mike. Can you give us a brief history of the location of Babylon? For instance, did Cain reside there prior to the flood, followed by Nimrod after the flood, where Nimrod may have rebuilt some of the older structures built by Cain? Any significant events from then till modern day, and or do you expect revelations will play out in some manner in this location?
Yeah, there's again a lot in that question, so I'm just trying to clear my voice as I go here because I had a drink of water and went down the wrong pipe. So yeah, so just be a little bit patient with me as I work through that. So I think that's a very, very good question in terms of wanting to know, is there any connections in geography to before the flood, to immediately after the flood, and then to, end time events. So let's start in prehistory and with the time of Cain, but just before Cain, and in Genesis 2, we're introduced to the Garden of Eden. And nobody knows exactly where the Garden of Eden is. There's lots of theories on it. But what we do know is flowing out of that Garden of Eden are 4 rivers. And what's interesting about that is 2 of them have Eastern relationships to the question. So you have the Euphrates River, which everybody knows is in the Mesopotamian region. And then you have the Hiddekel, which is the Tigris River. And of course, that's in the Fertile Crescent. So when Cain is ostracized for killing Abel and he leaves, he goes to the land of Nod. We're not told where Nod is, but he goes east of Eden. And most people kind of think that Garden of Eden, not everybody, but a lot of people think that Eden was somewhere around the covenant land. And so when Cain is ostracized, he goes east of Eden and into these 2 rivers, in the region of the Tigris or the Hiddekel and the Euphrates River. And so what's really interesting about that is when we get into the time after the flood and the time of Nimrod and the time of Babel, is that Babel city and Babel tower is being built in the land of Shinar. And Babel is the first city that Nimrod builds. And then he's going to build some other cities, and I'll make some connections there in a few minutes. But if you look at Shinar and you take that back to what Strong's Concordance does in terms of its meaning, it's a country of 2 rivers, which is, I think, the Euphrates and the Tigris, or the Hiddekel, as the King James Version calls it, east of Eden. And Shinar is the ancient home of Chaldea and or Babylon. And that's where Nimrod stays after the confusion of the languages when everybody else leaves. And Shinar is actually a transliteration of Sumer or Sumeria, which is where we get so much ancient history from before the flood, coming from the Anunnaki, the Sumerian kings list, coming out of that region that's connected likely to Cain. And Cain is meshed in polytheist accounting of the history as being sort of the first progenitor of that Sumerian's king list, along with some of his early sons before the Nephilim come along and take it over in the time of Noah. And we also have cities that Nimrod is going to build in Shinar, in Sumer, in Chaldea, in Babylon. From after the Tower of Babel, he is going to, I don't think he builds, I think it's probably renovates or restores the city of Erech, which is the transliteration of the Sumerian city of Uruk. And what's interesting about that is that the first city that Cain builds in the land of Nod is named after his son Enoch, or Hanok, although you wouldn't pronounce the H. And according to researchers like David Roll and other secular researchers, is that Uruk is the Babylonian transliteration for what the city was called by the Sumerians, which would have been Anuk or Anuki, depending on which researcher that you're going to read about. So you have a Babylonian name, which is Uruk, which is transliterated Erech, and could possibly even be, if these researchers are correct, actually the city of Anuk or Enoch that was built by Cain in the land of Nod as the first city. And of course, polytheist accounts has Cain and Enoch building over 60 cities. And so they could have built many of these ancient Sumerian cities before the flood and before the actual Nephilim came along. And then as Nimrod's account after the flood continues in the land of Chaldea, Babylon, or Sumeria, he is going to build the city of Akkad, which is the dynasty and the powerhouse of the middle of the Mesopotamian region that's going to succeed the dynasty of Nimrod and Babylon after that. So, you get kings like Sargon that are coming up in the Akkadian dynasty that succeeds. And then out of that comes Assyria as a takeover and inheriting. There's a little bit of back and forth between the kingdom of Sumer, which is a civilization and a kingship in that area after the flood, as described in Genesis 14 with Amraphel, who's the king of Shinar. And so he's in the alliance of Mesopotamian giant kings in the War of Kings in the land of the covenant in the time of Abraham. But continuing, you have the land of Asher as coming out of the Nimrodian bloodlines and dynasty as a successor down the road, as post-Diluvian Genesis 10 talks about. And just as you have, and that's Assyria, and just as you have those two rivers being in Asher that we talked about before the flood, Euphrates and the Tigris. And that is going to produce the Assyrians and the Assyrian dynasty. And of course, he's also going to build Nineveh, which is in the Assyrian dynasty, as is Kala in Assyria, as is Rehoboth and Rezin. So all of these cities are built in and around the area that Cain would have went to, and that Nimrod chose to build Babel. And then I think what he did was he renovated many of these cities that Enoch built. And Erech is likely Uruk and the city of Enoch, built before the flood.
Thank you. Next question is from Eileen. Your book talks of serpents that prior to the Garden of Eden originally had 2 legs, but were cursed to crawl after Eden. Please describe how this group fit into the power and or religion structure that I am assuming would have been used to dominate day 6 creation prior to the arrival of Adam and Eve. Finally, were the fallen angels in this early period of time creating offspring/giants directly with day 6 creation that would have also played a role in that religious structure?
I answered a lot of this early on in the show, so I won't be quite as long-winded on this answer. So I'll try and be quite crisp on it. So yes, within a cache, these are beings that were actually taller than humans, and they were as tall as a camel, so they were significantly taller, and they could do a lot of work as well. They were very powerful beings, and we don't know, as I mentioned earlier, is how they're created, except that they're sentient beings and they have a serpent look because they're the serpent, as what Satan, the dragon and serpent is, and the seraphim angels are. So I think they were a prized being of the rebellious angels, and I do think they were raised above the people of day 6, and I do think that with the arrival of Adam, that it threatened that hierarchy before, that was in place before. And if you think about how long a day is, it could be 1,000 years, it could be more, but we do get a day is like 1,000 years. And what we get with the Genesis account of day 6, you have the Sabbath that follows after, so you have at least 1,000 years if a day is 1,000 years in this application. And then you have the creation of Adam afterwards. So there was some sort of hierarchy and or things going on with the people of day 6, because as I say, I can't reconcile the details. And so it seems to me Adam was created for a special commission to put an end to the angelic rebellion, and so that humankind could be raised higher than angels in the future world, adopted as sons of God, even though we have human fathers, and will judge angels in the future times. So I think that the angels were wanting to bring down humankind, and the Nakash had skin in the game too, because they were no longer the most elevated, kingly, highest status sentient being of that time. And certainly they're the ones who lost their legs, their arms, their speech, their intelligence, for their complicity in the conspiracy to bring down Adam and Eve in Satan's first revenge in the garden. So yeah, I think that that is a very open question as to where and how the Nakash are created, where they come from, and how they arrive. We're only told that they're there and that they are a symbol of royalty, as I talked about previous in the show. And so then the question gets to be, and which is raised properly here, is did angels have sex with the people of day 6 before the Genesis account? We don't get anything in scripture that says that that happened, but we don't get anything in there that says it didn't happen either. But the first account we get of this type of violation against the laws of creation is in Genesis 6. And again, we talked earlier about the serpent seed from Cain as a possibility. This is a possibility. We just don't get those smoking gun verses. So I remain open to those concepts, but we really don't need it to have the serpent account or other Nephilim accounts, because in Genesis 6 it says not only did the sons of God go to them at that time, but again afterwards, and we're not told how many times afterwards. So all the different kinds of Nephilim could have been created afterwards, or there was a violation against the laws of creation that wasn't sexual copulation before, that was in some sort of DNA manipulation or things like that. And the reason why I would mention something like that, that's a possibility, is because you have like elementals that are talked about in the New Testament. The word that most people would associate that in terms of Colossians, in terms of where it's as a heavenly sort of being or demonic type of being, would be the rudiments that it's talked about amongst the same as the principalities and the powers. And so the elementals are considered in polytheism to be the little people. Again, we're not told how they're would be created from the Bible. And in fact, we only have this connection that there is some sort of hierarchical structure in the spurious forces that are rudiments. That is also means elementals as you take that back to Greek. But you have this classification of these little people that are divided into three groups that, is a big topic on fairies, and they were created as part of the ruling hierarchy in the antediluvian realm. And so the gnomes, for example, would look after knowledge and genealogies and technology, and are very much connected to what we would understand as some of the fairies and the fairy kidnappings that have happened all throughout history, that are recorded all around the world, that are very similar to alien abductions. And we actually get in Ezekiel 27 the Gamadim, which are in the towers of Tyr. I think they're shooting arrows, as I recall. And again, you get the Gamad, and the I am is the male plural, and these were warriors. And Gamad means a cubit. So these beings were somewhere between 18 inches and 21 inches tall, depending on how you measure a common cubit or a royal cubit, and very much these little people. So we do get a few connections in there about other types of creations in the Bible, but not a whole bunch. And we're not given any information as to how they're created. Now, in polytheism, you get lots of accounts that these little people were again created from, the offspring of the gods again, whether or not it's with another animal or whatever, or they're actually done through some sort of DNA manipulation. That was more of an allegory. Again, we don't know, but the world is filled with a history of these little beings. So you have, I guess what I'm saying with when I'm talking about these different types of creations is that there may have been some sort of DNA manipulation for those beings before the flood and before Genesis 6. And maybe that's how some other Nephilim kinds of beings were created, but not with a sexual format. But again, I have to stress, I am speculating on all of that. And for me, I settle more on Genesis 6 as the easy solution, that I don't have to start going down past that I can't fully support biblically.
Thank you. Next question, also from Eileen. Can you provide a very brief synopsis and timeline of who the major biblical players and empires were after the flood? It gets very confusing to me trying to understand this timeline. For instance, I have read Sumeria was the first of the empires/cities. However, I would think it should be Babylon instead. And where and when does Assyria fit in? And some of the major empires like Egypt?
Yeah, so it's very important to understand the empire aspect of it and some of the peoples. I mean, we'll get like the Cadmonites that is in Genesis that's listed amongst the Kenizzites and the Kenites, and the Cadmonites are the eastern peoples and thought to be a Rephaim type of people from the east. And Rephaim that Nimrod would have intermarried with to create the dynasties that are going to come forward out of Chaldea or Babylon. And as I mentioned, this is the area, just a question to her before, is Shinar, which is Sumeria. And so this Middle East area is going to be sort of this embryo of a lot of these empires that are all descending down through Nimrod's descendants in that area that is going to beget Assyria. But let me just sort of back up a step on this so that I can explain connections of the world empires as it is related to Israel and the early post-Diluvian period, and how it's also related in prophecy. So there's some very, very interesting connections there. And so, and again, we have, as I said, these Mesopotamian kings that come out in Genesis 14 that I mentioned earlier as well. So Israel is kind of a product of the empires, if I can put it that way. And everything that is surrounding Israel has an empire relationship to it of the ancient world, as well it will be in the end time. And so in Revelation 17, we're told about the last Roman revived empire that comes out of the seven before. And I know you can take this two ways, and I think it's both in terms of understanding prophecy. So you've got seven that come out of Genesis 8 with Greece, and you've got Alexander, the four empires after Rome, and then the new Rome that gives you in the end time, which gives you seven. But I also believe it means the seven major empires of the world. And in the beginning, the first empire is Egypt. And so where is Israel brought up and raised in slavery before the Exodus? In Egypt. And so within that sort of womb of slavery, they're allowed to grow into a great nation until God decides they're ready. And so that's your first relationship with the world power. And after Babel, you have Mizraim go over to Egypt to start the Egyptian empire, and then they're going to intermarry. And the polytheists actually think that Nimrod has his descendants actually usurp the pharaonic dynasty in Egypt with his grandson or his son, depending on which version that you're looking at that on. And so you've got Egypt as the parallel empire, but rising to a greater level before these other empires do from Nimrod in the Middle East. And so after Israel grows up and leaves Egypt, you have the Assyrian Empire that is the next world empire. And it's this Assyrian Empire in 721 BC, 718, 721, 723, somewhere in that range, depending on, again, who you're reading about or from on these historical accounts. They are going to send Israel, the northern tribes, into captivity and destroy the northern empire as part of the curses of the covenant for not keeping the covenant. And so again, we see a significant impact of why it's important to know who these empires are and their players. And Assyria, as we talked about, extends out of the Akkadian Empire and out of this nest of empires of Sumer, which is Chaldea and Babylon, where Babel was built, that Nimrod stayed in, as I talked about earlier. And Shinar is a transliteration of Sumer in the two rivers of the Tigris and which is the Nicodel and the Euphrates rivers. Okay, and out of that comes the Assyrian Empire. And then out of that, you have Babylon taking over for Assyria, essentially just taking over that empire. And now it's Babylon in about 589 BC that is going to do the same thing to the southern kingdom, which is Judah, for violations of the covenant, even though they got a reprieve from the Assyrians for repenting one more time, but they continue to backslide, and they're going to suffer the consequences of the curses of the covenant, and they're taken into captivity into Babylon, and only a remnant of them. But again, another embryo type of scenario here, and that they're going to increase in numbers, and then Persia is going to take over from Babylon while Judah is in captivity. And at the same period of time, the lost tribes of Israel will be dispersed, as you learn in Ezekiel, to the four winds of the earth, or the four winds of the empires of the earth, to the four corners of the earth, and lost until the end time, when they'll awaken. And then Persia permits the second temple to be built, and Cyrus issues the decree, and a little time later, they'll move back and set up the second temple. And then they're going to be affected by Greece. Greece is going to come in and overrule them again, because they're not living the way they ought to be living in terms of the covenant. And then Rome, after them denying the Messiah that was sent to them, they're going to suffer the curses of the covenant again. They're going to be dispersed to the four corners of the world, but remain visible as opposed to invisible, that Israel is lost. And so we need to understand that the bloodlines that come out of the people that Nimrod married into are the Rephaim, and they usurp all of the kingships and the royal dynasties of the world, both back then and all the way through history. And these are going to be part of the end time 10 kings of the 10 groups of nations of the end time. In Daniel 2:43, as it talks about the metallic part of these dynasties, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome, and the end time empire. In Daniel 2:43, the descendants of these metallic empires are actually going to intermarry with the seed of humankind. So it's either the descendants of those metallic empires or new Nephilim at that time of creating the world government are going to intermarry with humankind in the end time. So it's important to understand the relationship of the empires to the fulfillment of everything talked about in the Holy Covenant, and will be acted upon and fulfilled through these empires, including the last end time empire when Israel is going to awaken. And getting back to a part of a question I didn't answer on early on is how does some of this land come into play in the end time in terms of the Mesopotamian region? Well, we talked about earlier in the show about the midpoint of the last 7 years where Judah is going to flee from Antichrist and Satan at the time of the abomination, and also as it's recorded in Revelation 12, and the dragon Satan is going to shoot this river at them to try and destroy them. But God steps in again and saves them. And they're going to await the second Exodus when Jesus leads the awakened Israelites back to meet up with them and the visible Judeans around the world, the true remnant, back into the wilderness to remain until Armageddon is over. And this is what's talked about in Ezekiel 37 in terms of bringing those rods back together. And we know again that that's the end time in the second Exodus, because as you get into the teens of Ezekiel 37, where it has the dry bones prophecy in there as well that I won't touch on at this point, but it's all part of the end time events, you have the second Exodus talked about. And so all of this is taking place after Antichrist is crowned king in the temple. So begins the bowl judgments and the wrath of God in the last 3.5 years. And Isaiah will talk about this overwhelming scourge that is going to overtake Israel, that is rooted back. And again, I've got a great document on this. If people want to get a hold of me, I'll lay it out for you step by step, that this great torrent is actually the Euphrates River that is currently dammed up, that I think is going to be broken, that is going to be let loose to try and overtake fleeing Judah at that point in time. And what's really interesting about those verses and those passages in Isaiah is it talks about God annulling the covenant at this time. And that's because he is annulling the covenant. Judah and lost Israel, the people that they lived in, the people lost Israel who lived in the countries, were part of the countries, will sign this original covenant. God annuls it at the time of this overwhelming scourge that comes out of the mouth of the dragon. This is the covenant that is signed in Daniel 9:27 that starts the last 7 years, and Antichrist starts his rise to power, culminating with all of his false credentials, with counterfeit Armageddon, counterfeit rapture, counterfeit everything, and fakes being Jesus with his own Armageddon. And this will start his alleged new age or millennial reign, all before Jesus comes. And so if people are saying, well, when does Jesus come for rapture? Well, again, that's another rabbit hole, but I would say slightly after the midpoint of the last 7 years, after Babylon is destroyed and Antichrist destroys Babylon in Revelation 17, just as Jeremiah 51 talks about, where you can also connect back to what I was talking about, Abaddon, which is the word destroy, and the destroyer that's used in Jeremiah 51 is the term that's used to destroy Babylon. We know Antichrist is the one who destroys Babylon, and we've connected him to Azazel and Abaddon and Apollyon as that incarnation or that avatar effect to give him the power in the end time to make him the true Antichrist figure. So just connecting some of the other questions with the answer in there. So you need to understand who the players are in terms of the empires and how they affect Israel, and how they have affected Israel throughout the age of the covenant and will continue to affect them throughout the end time. So we're going to see, as that part of that geography take place, is that I believe in terms of the end time that was asked earlier, in terms of, between the two rivers or the land of Nod, somewhere in the wilderness in the eastern region where the Euphrates flows is likely where Israel is going to be taken to and Judah flees to in the end time.
Thank you. So we have one last question before we go into the live questions, and this is one that Justin added right before we went live. But this question is from Justin. Many people have been claiming that Trump is the Antichrist after the peace deal release. What is your view on how this actually ties into biblical prophecy?
Well, I think it moves the agenda forward, but he's not Antichrist. I think it would be very difficult to have the people of Judah accept somebody who doesn't have a Davidic bloodline. And I don't see any of that in Trump's genealogy that comes to mind in any sort of significant way, or any sort of Jewish connections, other than his daughter has married in with Kushner into the Judaic society. Now, it could be an offspring that maybe comes from them down the road, but this is not this is not Daniel 9:27. This is not the covenant that's going to bind the whole world under one covenant. It is a piece of the covenant that is coming. It is the evolving covenant, but I don't believe President Trump is going to be the one who brings the whole world government together. And I'm not even convinced that, even though he's proposed this, that he's going to get that far along on it. They may get a piece of it in. And some of the new ideas in there in terms of having East Jerusalem being recognized as the Palestinian capital is one of those steps along the way. And maybe parts of it will be put in place, but it won't bring peace to the area. And the only way that I think Israel is going to accept a peace treaty for security is after the United States is weakened in some sort of way, I think. So I would be looking for some catastrophes in the US, whether it's economic, militarily, disasters or whatever, or a combination, to reduce the US's influence so that they cannot guarantee Israel's security anymore. And it has to be secured by this world government that comes out of the signing of the covenant that is sponsored by the universal religion. And so you need the universal religion first, and then that brings about these 10 empire kings, these 10 regions together, and you need the signing of this covenant that includes Israel as that whole package, and will also permit Israel, or people of Judah as we understand them today as being Israel, can have the sacrifice start up, the sacrifices of their holy feasts on a wing or an extremity of the temple, which is the Islamic mosque today. So either built off to the side, or it's not quite on the exact location, but it's going to take a universal religion to bring Islam to heal to permit that to happen. So there's a lot of things to happen that have to happen in conjunction as well as the treaty. And I just think this is just one of those steps to move things forward. I think it's a big step in terms of its ideology to move forward, but I don't believe he's going to be the one to be able to pull much of it off. And they may even wait till he's no longer in power to adopt his ideas, because right now the Palestinians don't want to have anything to do with them on it. But that could be just a negotiating position as well. But the short answer is I think that this is just another step, a big step on the way, just as recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel was a significant step.
Thank you. All right, moving on to live questions. First one being from MJM. Gary stated the two pillars of religion from Egypt and Babylon were originally very similar. How are they different, though, and how did this flow through to today?
Well, they're essentially the identical religion, because you have the Babylon religion that is started at the Tower of Babel. And so when we look at the imagery of Babylon, the end time, this is that universal religion that Nimrod starts right after the flood. And it's the same Enochian mysticism that is started by Enoch, son of Cain, that we talked about, who built maybe the city of Erech and Uruk, originally that Nimrod renovated or restored, who developed this mystical religion to house the knowledge that he was channeling into the disciplines of the seven sacred sciences or the seven liberal arts. So when we look at, that's the religion that crosses the flood somehow as being the same religion, it makes sense, because nothing is new under the sun. Now, we're not told in the Bible that is the Enochian mysticism, but if you look at what the polytheists believe, and particularly the Freemasons, they say that Hermes finds the two pillars of Lamech in their belief system that had the location of the knowledge and all of the different rituals and things of the religions hidden in 9 vaults in 36,525 books underneath the pyramids. He finds the pillars with the direction to get that knowledge and of the religion, and he takes that back to Nimrod, partners with Nimrod, and that's the knowledge and the religion that starts the rebellion, and the knowledge that allows them to start to build the city. Because where does the knowledge come from right after the flood? Certainly Noah wouldn't have been teaching them this knowledge that caused the flood before, or the religion that caused the flood beforehand. So he has to get the knowledge from somewhere, and we see that knowledge reflected in building the first city and this tower or pyramid up into the sky that he's going to try and reach into heaven with, which takes an incredible amount of technology and knowledge to be able to do. And we get a hint of this knowledge in the narrative that says, speaking one language and working as one people, nothing they try to do will be, prevented from them doing. So this is the application of the knowledge that brought down the antediluvian world. Hermes goes in the Masonic accounts of prehistory, partners with Mizraim after Babel, after the confusion of languages, and goes to Egypt with him and establishes the Egyptian part of that religion that was worshipped in Babel beforehand, and Nimrod continues with that religion. And these are the two religions that spread around the Mediterranean and into the east, into the Indus Valley, and then into China, the same base religion that goes around the world. Now, whether or not the Hermes aspect is part of it or not, what does happen is Mizraim goes to Egypt and sets up the same pantheon of gods, just with different vernacular names.
Thank you. Next live question is from Facts Not Fiction. When Adam and Eve arrived, how did Satan need to change his storyline to manipulate religion? For example, did Satan now need to factor in a virgin birth into the false religions?
Well, I don't think we get a virgin birth that comes in with the false religions. So Maybe read the first part of that question. I wasn't sure about the relationship to
Sure.
Adam and Eve there.
Sure. Let's see. When Adam and Eve arrived, how did Satan need to change his storyline to manipulate religion? For example, did Satan now need to factor in a virgin birth into the false religions?
Yeah, so they take a different route, and I kind of talked about that earlier in the show, is that they need to have these prophets and Messiah type figures all throughout history that are there sent to humankind to help them on their way. And they use that word, the way, just as Jesus does. It's a different way. It's the way of Cain. It's the way of Taoism. It's the way of destruction, but on the way to evolving into gods. And they do that through incarnations. Okay. Jesus, he's implanted into the womb to have a vessel grown for him, so, as a virgin birth. An incarnation is an angel that enters into an existing human already, generally a child, at least in the Hindu version, and is called an incarnation. So they are in this symbiotic relationship. Well, this is a body that's built for Jesus that is going to house and be a habitat for the Word as an oikotarian for his place on earth. So he's not sharing a host of a body. It is a body created for him, which is why Jesus then becomes the Word afterwards and is resurrected, and why they merge into one. But the Word is what Jesus was before in the spirit realm. And we also I think we see Jesus as the Word, as the angel of the Lord in the Old Testament, particularly at the time of the Exodus. And so that's a pre-Jesus version. And I also think we get that same sort of pre-version in Melchizedek, because Melchizedek does not have a genealogy in the Bible, and as Hebrews talks about. And this is the order that Jesus is going to take over as being an immortal, as being, the Word that came from God. And so just because this body was used to sacrifice Jesus doesn't mean it just disappears. It becomes part of the Word, because that was the body for him, but it's also now that body and Word are in heaven together, and the Word as Jesus' body is coming back for the second time. So these are two totally different concepts. So there is no virgin birth. There is only an incarnation into a child or an adult that already has a host in it, and it is not the same concept, but that is their Messiah concept in polytheism, is an incarnation. So combining with a rebellious angel to lead humankind.
Thank you. Next question is from Anita Evangel. Isaiah 24:5, the Strong's Hebrew lists the word ordinance as appointment of time/space. What are your thoughts on this?
Run that question again.
Sure. The question was, in Isaiah 24:5, the Strong's Hebrew lists the word ordinance as appointment of time/space. I can also read Isaiah 24:5 if that would help.
Yeah, please read it in context for me as well.
Sure. The earth also is defiled under the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant.
So I'd have to bring up the word ordinance to see what the other meanings are. So the first thing that I would say is that most Hebrew words have at least have more than one meaning. So as you're applying the meaning to the narrative, which is why you need to have the verse read in context so that you select the right meaning for it. And so I think when it talks about the Holy Covenant, it is not talking about time, space, dimension there, because the Holy Covenant is about the time of Israel on earth that's going to fulfill not only the time of Israel, but the time of the Gentiles through to the end time, and when we will have another 1,000 years, and then as we go along that timeline, you have us being raised above angels in the future time. So you can make a connection to time. I'd have to see what the other meanings of that word are to see what the right context is on it. So it may have a connection to the Holy Covenant goes beyond the meaning of time and the ordinance thereof and into different dimensions, because as we move into the future time, we'll have access to all the different dimensions. But again, it's hard. I'd have to go up and actually read all of the definitions in Strong's to make the assessment on that. So, but it's interesting though that there is a connection of time as you take that Holy Covenant, that it is everlasting and will transcend time for sure.
Thank you. Next question is from James Reynolds. In Jasher 80:19, a Sulanuth is described coming out of the sea having long arms, 10 cubits in length, of a cubit of a man. It uncovered the rafters and flooring and cut them. What is a Sulanuth?
I have no idea. So the problem with the book of Jasher is that we don't have an original Hebrew copy of it. So we can't take those words back. And we're not even sure it's the original book and that it hasn't been heavily corrupted. In fact, the book of Jasher has a lot of corruptions in it that has a lot of mysticism in it. And it's got words out of time and place and a whole bunch of different things. I have a document on why to be careful with Jasher, but I have no idea what that word would be in Hebrew, and that would be the only way that I could track it down. And I've not tracked that down, so I'll have to say I don't know.
Thank you. Next question is from Astrid Quotidian. Who/where is Ophir, Tarshish, and Sheba today?
Well, I would imagine that they're talking about the peoples, as opposed to, the place, right? Because they were, definitely places. So again, as when you're talking about those kinds of places in the end time, you have to be very, very careful as to the application of the word, and then is it in an allegorical sense for the end time. So typically what they're talking about are the peoples of those people for the end times. So I would really hate to speculate as to who all of those peoples would be as they're spoken of then, and all the different migratory patterns that have happened in the past. I mean, I can we can talk about who they were in the past, but who they are today, I haven't done the research to try and track migratory migrations of different peoples around the world.
Thank you. Next question from Mike Williams. Biblically speaking, do you know what the combination of letters IEM mean? And who exactly is the Archangel Michael, and what is his significance?
So is there an example of the IEM, or is that?
No, there's no example here. Maybe we could just answer the second part.
Okay, who is the Archangel Michael?
Yep.
Is that the question?
Who is the Archangel Michael, and what is his significance?
Well, his name is Michael, and he's an archangel, and he's cited in some very interesting passages. And so an archangel and Gabriel is the only other one that we get in the standard canon of the Bible. There are thought to be 7 of these archangels, and they're thought to be the 7 angels that stand, around God as part of the archangels, as part of the seraphim, as part of the Ophanim, and as part of the cherubim that surround God at the top end of the hierarchy. And Michael is the one who is going to stand up and fight for Israel in the end time, as Daniel 12 talks about. And he is the one who is going to battle and lead the angels from heaven against Satan and his angels at the midpoint of the last 7 years. So I think that's what Daniel is partially talking about, standing up at that time, and throws Satan and those angels down to the earth for the last 3.5 years. Michael is also the one who fights for his people, Israel and Judah, as talked about in Daniel. And in fact, he's fighting against, in Daniel at this time, when he talks about this, he's saying that he's fighting Persia at this point in time. And then after Persia, he's going to go fight against Greece. So he's the one that is holding off these empires that I talked about earlier and fights against them so that they don't totally take over the world and bring about the end time before its ordained time, and they don't wipe all of the good people from the face of the earth. And that's what Michael is doing. He's holding off these empires. And so one presumes he continues this through the Roman period, through the period after the fall of Rome, and into the end time, when you have the rise of the end time empire for the first 3.5 years of the last 7, that he's going to hold off the period of time where they can do anything that they want until the Armageddon comes. And I think when he is removed, that's when the last 3.5 years take place. Although one could argue that he might even be removed a little bit before that, which would start the last 7 years. And I think that makes him a good candidate for being the restrainer, because he's the one who fights against the empires.
Thank you. Next question is from Ibelissima. In Gary's book on page 7, he says Jabal, the first nomad who raised livestock. My question is, wasn't Abel doing that first?
Well, he would have to be, but the context of how that I written it. So let's just back up. So yeah, the question and statement is posed correctly, is that Abel was raising animals, and one presumes Adam probably did that even in Eden. From the polytheist perspective that I let them talk about, and from the development of the sciences and the knowledge that comes from Enoch, and this goes down through as to the time of Lamech, of the lineage of Cain and Enoch, whose offspring are Jubal, Nama, and Tubal-Cain. And livestock, as is being mentioned in the question here, is the one who is creating this to a different sort of level. What we don't know is what happened to that knowledge of what Abel did after Abel was killed. I presume it probably went down the Sethian line, but when I let the polytheists speak for their accounts, this is from their understanding of when the art of livestock and the cross-pollination and mixing of species and things like that, and the genetic type of breeding would have started as part of the sciences, as opposed to the first offerings and the first fruits of that offering and sacrifice as Abel would have done.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It is 9:58 p.m. I think that's all the questions we can take for tonight. And if you did not get your question answered tonight, we're so sorry, but feel free to email us at sacredwordpublishingllc@gmail.com with subject line questions for Gary. And as always, we thank you so much, Gary, for your time. And I know that the listening audience didn't get to watch you on video, but I did. And the delight that just sparks on your face when you hear these questions is true. It just shows, I feel, your sincerity and your love for sharing your research, and we're so grateful for you in doing so. So with that said, Gary, if you could close us out in prayer, that would be fantastic.
Absolutely. Father in heaven, we thank you for the opportunities to bring the people of your followers together in communion to exchange information. We pray that you will make this even more available so that more and more people can communicate and exchange information and dig deeper and learn more about you and your word, and can pass this information on to people who aren't listening in the show, and to plant the seeds and to encourage people to learn more about your scripture so that we're prepared for the end times. And we pray that you bless all of the people who have been part of the show tonight, and that they'll remember and or dig deeper into the things that have been talked about, and to give them the knowledge and the spirit to be able to convey what they've learned, and in a way that will role model how we should be as Christians, role model what our beliefs are, and how to prepare for the things that are coming. And so we thank you for permitting this to happen, and we thank you for all the things you have provided for us as creator of us and creator of all things. And we pray these things in the name of our Redeemer, the Word Jesus, who sits at your right-hand side and testifies to you for us and for all of the saints. We also pray in the name of the Holy Spirit, in your great and holy name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Gary. And can you please one last time put out your information so that people know where to get all the content that you suggested getting from you? Yes, that would be great.
So best way to get hold of me is through my website at the Genesis6conspiracy.com. That's Genesis 6 with the number 6conspiracy.com. You can get a copy, a signed copy of the book for me if you like. You can also link over to Barnes & Noble, Kindle, and Amazon from that site, and you can get a generous excerpt of all 98 chapters. And on that website, there is an email where you can contact me. So if there's a subject area that we were talking about tonight, and you want to document or you want to ask me a question, best way is through the email off that website. You can also do that through Messenger under Gary Wayne on Facebook, or on my wall or timeline on Gary Wayne. It's an open timeline, so you can post a question there, or get a hold of me through Twitter at GaryWayne63, at GaryWayne63.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you next month. Shalom and good night.
Good night.
Sacred Word Revealed comes to Atlanta, Georgia on March 27th through 29th, 2020. Purposed to reveal end times mysteries, to prepare the final generation, we must don the full armor of God. Featuring Zen Garcia, Gary Wayne, Stephen and Jana Ben-noon, Dr. Stephen Pidgeon, Justin James Garcia, Dr. Joye Pugh, Rob Skiba, Laurel Austin, buy your tickets now at sacredwordrevealed.com.